tonight we begin with a rather interesting document in Egyptian history. Last week we looked at the Amose stele, which contained a lot of parallels between a great storm that hit Egypt and some of the plagues that are mentioned in scripture. We had certain unspecified days of darkness. We had hail and a storm that came upon Egypt. We also evidenced that there perhaps could have been a volcanic eruption associated with this event. And in fact, when we look at the supervolcano in the Mediterranean called Santorini, we discover that in fact it did erupt at this particular point in time. So we find there's a lot of parallels for the Exodus story. Then from there, we looked at Hatshepsut's Sapadeos Artemis inscription, where she talks about the Asiatics who had lived in the reign about 50 to 70 years prior to her days, and how they had wreaked havoc on the Delta region. They had destroyed temples, there had been rain, and she credits herself with restoring the temples, restoring the gods, and having cleared the rain-swept roads. Now, I'm going to get fancy for a minute. I'm going to see the video isn't just real good. I'm going to see, let me see here. No, I'm just going to leave it alone because I don't want to go back to Minnie Mouse. So I'm just going to leave the video alone for now. So when we look at this, this is not the only document. Those of you that have heard me teach on this before, we have another document that gives a lot of parallels to the account in Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. And these are the events that occur at the time of Moshe or Moses's birth. And what we discover is that this new dynasty arises in Egypt. They don't respect their traditional Egyptian traditions. They don't really respect much of anything. They don't have much respect for the Egyptians themselves. They overthrow the traditional pharaonic government. They install their own, and then they make slaves. They make captives and workers out of your noble class that once ruled over the peasants of the realm. So this is very much a time of reversal for Egypt. And the document that I am referring to is called the Admonitions of Epur. Now, the Admonitions is interesting because we can't really date the document. And we can't date it because it was actually written during the 19th dynasty, so somewhere in Ramessid times, but it refers to an earlier epic. It's compiled off of written evidence, and it's written as instruction for the king. And Epur, the scribe who speaks to the king, is telling him, don't allow Egypt to fall into the chaos that it had fallen into under this previous dynasty. So we find very interesting facts and very interesting parallels within this description. First of all, we find that the document is usually dated, and this in modern terms, the Admonitions of Epur is technically called the Papyrus Leiden, scroll number 344, just for the technical reference. And it's dated between 1700 and 1600. This was the tumultuous time in Egyptian history where you had Asiatics from Canaan migrating into the Delta region because of a severe famine in Egypt. We find, of course, severe famine in Canaan. We know from the Exodus story that Joseph was there in Egypt right when this severe famine occurred that brought all of these immigrants seeking shelter, seeking food. The way that the Nile worked and the way that Egypt's climate worked, the Nile usually was not affected by the famines that plagued the Mediterranean. And we see this throughout history that when you have a famine in this geographical region, it usually affects Canaan, it will affect Edom, it will affect Turkey, and parts of the Mediterranean coast. So it's usually that geographic region where, and of course Israel or Canaan, where it is in one one location where famines occur, because Egypt, the Nile is based off of Lake Victoria, very far south. In Egypt, that region had a different climate, a different weather pattern, and so they were usually excluded from the famines that the rest of the Mediterranean or the Levant faced. Now, in this particular case, of course, we know that even much of northern Africa, much of Central Africa, the continent of Africa, was indeed affected by this famine as we get into the succeeding era. Stephen, so glad you're here. Glad you can make it. So when we get into the information, we find that Ipuwer is referring to a people's revolution. It's really this migrant revolution where you had these Asiatics that came into Egypt. They got into positions of authority. There's some scholars that advance that they were elected into these positions. But then after 100 years of being in Egyptians' territory, they really get tired of working and serving the traditional pharaohs or being a subservient class to the native Egyptians. So what you find that they do, they overthrow the Egyptian government. And with this overthrow, they really target the noble classes. And we're going to read some evidence of this. One of the things that they tell us, that Ipuwer tells us, is that they put the nobles into the corvée labor systems. So if you're following along with me on page 44, it says, "Lo, citizens are put to the grindstone. Wearers of fine linen are beaten with sticks. Lo, tomb builders become field laborers. Those who were in the God's barn are now yoked to it." This is a total reversal of fortune, something very similar to what we later see in the French Revolution, where the anger really comes out at the noble classes who really don't have to work as hard, who take advantage off of the serfdom of the rest of the kingdom. Were certainly issues with the Egyptian system. It ensured stability, and that's what we're going to see as we continue looking through the evidence of Ipuwer. And thank you so much for that, Stephen. I appreciate that comment, and I will try to follow that. You also find that we're going to see some parallels between the Exodus account and the history that Ipuwer has left to us. So this idea that the noble classes are now become part of the corvée, and there really is some question as to which side of the fence Israel would have been identified with. And I say this because Israel would have had loyalty to the traditional pharaohs of Egypt. So they were, the traditional pharaohs were overthrown, there was a coup, and they had to resort very south to Thebes. So the much of the Exodus story really doesn't even involve traditional Egyptian pharaohs. It involves Asiatic pharaohs that had invaded the Delta, and now they are ruling over Egypt, and they set themselves up as pharaohs. They take on pharaonic names. They begin pharaonic traditions of their own. They're very rough and coarse in the beginning of their history, but right around 1650 and 1620, we find a total change from an Asiatic application of government to an Asiatic Egyptian-styled form of government. And it's at this time that we find this incredible instability that really forms the background of the Exodus story. Now, Manetho tells us about a similar revolution that scholars will often point to being a reference to the exact same event. Let me share with you what Manetho said. I think I have the wrong page number here, so I'm just going to flip back to it real quick if y'all will give me a minute. And this again is part of what is called the Second Intermediate Period, when Asiatics from Canaan invade the Delta. And Manetho, who was a 3rd century BCE Egyptian scribe, he was well versed in Greek. He wrote a book on Egyptian history called Egyptica. Now, this book is lost to us today, but fragments of this text are preserved in Josephus. They are preserved in Jerome, and some of the church fathers quote from him, and that's why we have this today. So this is a quote from Josephus, but Josephus is quoting Manetho. What he tells us, he says that by main force, the Asiatics referred to, the Egyptians referred to the Asiatics as rulers of foreign land, from foreign lands. And this phrase is called Hyksos. So when you hear this term, it doesn't mean at first it was erroneously translated as shepherd kings. That is not correct. It is simply rulers from foreign lands. So these foreign rulers, it says, without striking a blow and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods. Finally, they appointed one of their own number, whose name was Salitas, and he had his seat at Memphis. He levied tribute from the upper and lower Egypt, always leaving garrisons behind. Later on, Josephus says that as in the reign of another monarch, this would have been that transition of Asiatic rulership right around 1650, 1620. This other ruling dynasty revolts against the other Asiatic dynasty and forms a brand new dynasty there in the Delta, right at what we call Pi-Ramses, but at this time it would have been called Averroes. So Josephus, Manetho tells us that they treated the natives of the land with cruel hostility. They massacred some and led the children and wives into slavery. They taxed, anytime you tried to use the Nile, your Nile in Egypt was your passageway between north and south. If you were going to go anywhere, you really had to navigate the Nile. And they had garrisons that would exact very steep tribute. The kings of the south from Thebes, Kamose, when he begins to challenge the Asiatic authority, one of the things that he brings up as a complaint in his stele is that, if we want to do any sort of commerce or we want to travel on the Nile, behold, the Asiatics charge the steep tribute. So we have this tribute idea not only from Manetho and from Epur, but we also have it from the Kamose stele. So three different sources that recognize this steep tribute that the Asiatics are exacting on Egypt during this time. Now that isn't where and that is really the background of Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. When you understand the political dynamics, you're then better to understand why other things like the death of the firstborn occurred under the context of this political situation. Later on, we find that Hatshepsut's inscription refers to Asiatics that had ruined temples and tombs. Remember, we just read in Manetho that it talks about temples and tombs being ruined. Ipur also talks about temples and tombs being ruined by the people during his day. He says, let me see if I can find it here. He talks about, let's see, I'm jumping ahead of myself, just trying to connect the dots with these particular discussions. So let me go back real quick. Yeah, he talks about how the tombs are destroyed and how the resting place of noblemen has been desecrated, and how the kings and the gods are being cast out. So these are all ideas that resonate with Hatshepsut, with Ipur, and then also with Amose's stele. The Amose storm stele also talks about temples being violated, about tombs being desecrated. So you really find that these three witnesses are all describing the exact same event, so it would appear. But more than this, something else that occurs in Egyptian history at this time is more of a theological revolution that perhaps provides a backdrop to the reason that the people decide to rebel. In previous epochs of Egyptian history, access to the gods was very limited and very restricted. You could really only have access to the gods if you had money. You had to be a noble person. Only then were you going to have an afterlife. Only then could you seek to the gods, because you had to have the priest be your intermediary and seek to the gods, find either the cause of your ailment or find whatever it was that you needed. Went through the priesthood, and going through the priesthood always required money. But there was this subtle revolution that occurred right about the time of the latter time of the Second Intermediate Period, beginning of the 18th dynasty with Amose. All of a sudden you have, which we would call a mystery religion, the Osiris cult, which was a fertility cult, where he died every fall and he arose every spring. You find that with this epic in time in Egyptian history, all of a sudden Osiris transcends into this god of the people. For the first time in, say, 1,500 years of Egyptian history, Osiris can now be accessed by the common citizen. The common citizen all of a sudden has access to an afterlife. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, you could have meet on the Elysian fields and enter into the afterworld. And so this idea of a God of the people may have formed a backdrop to this people's revolution, where they feel empowered, to take the law into their own hands, and that they can govern better than the ruling aristocracy that is, making money off of them, basically. I think we all, that idea kind of resonates with all of us. No one really wants to, fund the wealthy when you're doing all the grunt work. You really want some sort of stake in it. So what you find is that the Delta region, right around, like I said, 1650, 1620, erupts into a civil war. And this is what Ippur tells us. He says, the Delta dwellers carry a shield. A man regards his son as an enemy, hostility of another. Foreigners have become people everywhere. So this idea that, foreigners immigrate peacefully into the land once they have a majority, or maybe they're still a minority, but there's enough of them to overthrow the others. Perhaps the other people are very content in life. They really don't want conflict. So because of their love of peace, it's very easy for these immigrants to overthrow the traditional power that is in that area. So there is blood everywhere, no shortage of dead. Lo, many dead are buried in the river. The stream is a grave. The tomb has become a stream. Lo, the river is blood. So here we have this idea. I would not associate this idea of the river being blood to any of the plagues. I really think that is a misapplication, because this is simply in the context of civil war. What we find with the plagues in the Exodus is really a different context. But bear with me, because we are going to cover some other ideas that may shed some light on some Egyptian folklore stories that may preserve just a memory or a mythology of the underlying plagues that are recorded in Exodus. So now you find Ippur continues with this history, and he continues talking about this people's revolution that occurred. It began in the Delta, where all these foreigners were. It says, lo, poor men have become men of wealth. He who could not afford sandals owns riches. Lo, men's slaves, their hearts are greed. Lo, nobles lament, the poor rejoice. Everyone says, let us expel our rulers. The robber owns riches. The nobleman is a thief. Lo, noble women's, their bodies suffer in rags. Their hearts shrink from greeting each other. Lo, every have not is one who has. Those who were people are strangers whom shows the way. So one can't distinguish between the man of a pauper or the man of wealth or for a pauper. The serf has become the owner of serfs. Beggars come and go in great mansions, and there is much hatred in the street. So again, this is almost as if we are reading about the French Revolution, where you have just this utter hatred and loathing of the noble class. Now, this is what gets interesting, because you find that the thing with peasants, even though peasants have very justifiable claims, they don't often have the education and the skills and the understanding necessary to rule and administer over large groups of people. Instead, what you find is that it's like a riot where everybody goes in, they rob, they plunder, they destroy, and they take for themselves. No thought of the day after tomorrow. So what happens, in Egypt, you had one season to harvest. That had to last your entire society until the next inundation, where the ground would flood, that rich soil, then you could plant. And then somewhere around March, April, May is when you would have your harvest. So you had to have a system in place that sustained the life of Egypt. And this was always Pharaoh's job. It was Pharaoh's job to ensure that there was tranquility, to make sure that the resources of the Nile were stored and distributed among the people. Joseph is noted for doing this. He took 5% of the people to withstand the time of the famine. But even before the time of Joseph, pharaohs had this long-standing tradition of collecting a food tax, and storing it for the years wherein the Nile did not flood properly. About a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I posted on my Facebook page and tweeted as well, that archaeologists have discovered, now this is very late, this is like 3rd century BCE, but they had this stair-step water gauge where the water had to go to a certain height in order for there to be taxes collected in that year. So if the Nile did not flood, they would know right off the bat that you would not have enough harvest to go beyond just simply sustaining the local population. So if it didn't flood, then there would be no taxes, and you risk the risk of starvation. And the risk with starvation is also that you're going to have a loss of population due to famine, malnutrition, and death. So with that death, you lose part of your labor courts. You lose ways that you can make money in future years off of a corvée system. So Egypt was, all in all, not something that was so obtrusive that they were, they shot their foot to save the hand. They really had a system that was sustainable. Yes, it was oppressive, but it wasn't oppressive to the point where it was suicidal. So what you find with this revolution during the Second Intermediate Period is that it's rioting. People come in, they kill, they cast out the noble rulers. Every man takes for himself. And within a week or two, stores and supplies that were supposed to last for a year, maybe a year and a half, they're all consumed within the matter of a couple of weeks, and all of Egypt is starving. And again, this is right around 1650 or 1620 based on the dating system. So this is what Ippur tells us. He says, food is lacking, lo, the great hunger and suffer. He talks about how Egypt, because of this, they're no longer able to get the cedars of Lebanon to build their coffins for the traditional pharaohs and nobles. They now have to get this really cheap wood from Egypt that does not last very long. It deteriorates. So that's another woe for the Egyptians. Then it says, he who lacked grain owns granaries. He who fetched grain on loans issues it. Lower Egypt weeks. Now, Lower Egypt is the same thing of what we would call Northern Egypt. It is the Delta region. It says the king's storehouse is, I go get it, for everyone, and the whole palace is without its revenues. Towns are ravaged. Upper Egypt became wasteland. Lo, grain is lacking on all sides. Lo, people are diminished. Lo, the desert claims the land. So because the land isn't being used, it's not being taken care of by the people, the desert then reclaims the land because there's nothing to stop it. The gnomes are kind of like counties, but it says the gnomes are destroyed. And then it talks about gold is lacking because they're no longer able to mine for the gold. It says what belongs to the palace has been destroyed. Everyone says there's nothing. The storehouse is bare. Its keeper is stretched out dead on the ground. See now the transformations of foreign people. See, the judges of the land have been driven from the land. The nobles are expelled from their royal mansions. Princes are in the workhouses. So this really forms the backdrop of the events that occur right at Moses's birth. So when you get an idea for this conflict, for the very unstable economic and socio-political background, you can see where immigrants are viewed as a threat to Egypt. But beyond this, you know, we can't decide on just one scenario, because really both the archaeological, the written, as well as the biblical evidence really allows for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Actually, there's two pharaohs. So let me start first with the Pharaoh at Moses's birth. The Pharaoh at Moses's birth could have been Asiatic. He could have been Egyptian. There is a justifiable cause for them to want to keep the population very, very limited and very sparsely populated by either reigning monarch. The Egyptians on the account that the foreigners were growing in strength and that they had overthrown and revolted and to subdue that population. And on the Asiatic side, the exact same thing. They did not want a greater Egyptian population to gain the upper hand and to throw them out or to make them subservient again. It's very possible that the Hebrews would have been lumped in with some of the noble classes. And I say this because when Joseph and his brothers immigrated to Egypt, Pharaoh told Joseph, he says, if there's any man of industry among your brethren, set them as rulers over my shepherds and make them rulers over my house. So Joseph's brothers were actually involved in the traditional pharaonic administration of cattle, you know, kind of the crown's cattle. And what is fascinating with this, when Kamose, now Kamose was of the dynasty that had retreated south to Thebes, when the traditional pharaohs had been cast out of Avarez, and Kamose is ready to reestablish his legitimate rulership of the northern Delta region, one of the things that he states, he says, well, one of the things that his noble told him, as far as, you know, why should we worry about reconquering the Delta region? They say, behold, our cattle graze in the Delta region. You know, they're tended to. We receive payments for royalties or revenues from our flocks, and they haven't been molested. So there is perhaps some justification for saying that Joseph's brothers were still tending the very southern kingdom's crops cattle during this period of time. So it is a possibility. I mentioned again the idea of traffic blockade. Both Amose, Kamose, and Hatshepsut and Manetho. So we basically have 5 different sources that refer to how the Nile during this period was blockaded. You couldn't transport your goods upriver without some sort of fee. As far as tribute paid to the Asiatics, which really impeded trade because the tariffs that they charged were so exorbitant. Now we get to the interesting part, the part with Moses's birth. One of the things that Ipuwer tells us, he tells us 3 different times that infants are targeted in this revolution. And this is what he says. He says, lo, children of nobles are dashed against the wall. Infants are put out on high ground. In other words, they're really put out in the middle of a field, or they're put out somewhere in the desert to simply die of dehydration and starvation. It says, lo, children of nobles are dashed against the wall. Infants are put out on high ground. Lo, terror kills. Lo, women are barren, none conceive. So you find that women really do not want to conceive during this time because if they have a child, it will only be brought into the world to see death and suffering, because that is what is occurring. The power that is ruling at this point in time has his soldiers, his garrisons that go through the towns, go through the communities. If they know of a pregnant woman, if they know that she just gave birth, they're going to take that child and they are going to dispose of that child. Now, if you will remember, about 3-4 weeks ago, when we looked at the archaeological evidence for the Exodus, remember that we saw in Avarez, the capital city in the Delta at this time, we found that there was a disproportionate amount of infant burials compared to adult burials. In fact, the number of infant burials aged 1 to 3 months and even 1 to 6 months was something like 60% higher than adult burials right around 1620 BCE. When we go to biblical Python, which is called Tel El-Makusta, you find incredibly disproportionate. I mean, it's so disproportionate that actually the only graves that we find at that location are strictly infant graves. Archaeologists keep thinking they're going to find adult graves somewhere in the region and somewhere around that particular little village. But as of yet, those graves have eluded archaeologists and they haven't even found adult burials. I'm sure they're there, but what we will likely find is the same scenario with Avarez, where there is a disproportionate number of infant burials compared to adult. So this kind of wraps up the evidence for a pure papyrus. You know, we have the ideas of a people's revolution, where nobles are brought into a very strong corvée system. You know, they used to be the taskmasters, and now they're the servants who have different taskmasters. We also find that there's many people who, from Kamose, Omose, Hatshepsut, as well as Ippur, who refer to many of the same events that are later referred to again with Manetho. Now, there's another document in Egyptian history, and this document is very controversial. It's controversial because some of the traditions that are expressed in this document may go back to Egypt's Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom would predate the Exodus by a good 400 years. Now, if it is debatable. So we're going to I'm going to present the evidence and basically let you decide on whether it supports an Exodus story or whether it does not. And the document that I am referring to is an Egyptian document referred to as the destruction of mankind. In this document, and I'm on page 479 if you guys are following along. In this document, you find that there has been a rebellion against the god Ra. Now, Ra in Egyptian history was the supreme deity of Egypt. You know, even though nations were polytheistic, you always had, not always, but about 90% of the time, you had this idea of this supreme deity that kind of had more authority, more than all the other gods. So for Greece, it was Zeus. For Assyria, it was Azurmata. And for Egypt, it was Ra. So even though you had competing gods, and sometimes Ra or Zeus, sometimes they would merge into a new deity, and you might have 2 or 3 gods all involved and have one manifestation into this one god. So just keep that in mind. It was called kind of a triad unification, or sometimes it would be 4, it would be a quad unification. But this is just something that we see throughout not only Egyptian history, but also in Greek history, because they did the same thing to a lesser extent, but they still did the same thing. So we find in the document that is called The Destruction of Mankind, we find that there has been a rebellion against the god Ra. And we find that in this story, the rebels who have rebelled have escaped into the desert. Beyond this, we find that there is one of the most popular gods in Egyptian history. Her name is Hathor. In later times, she is known as Isis. But at this particular point in time in Egyptian history, she is called Hathor. She would have been the consort to Osiris. And you find that during her, for Hathor, that throughout Egyptian history, she was really known as this protective, loving deity. She was the deity that women sought to for childbirth. And all of a sudden, at a very late point in time in Egyptian history, Hathor all of a sudden turns into Sekhmet. And Sekhmet is this vengeful god, or goddess, I should say, to be technical here. She is somebody who is avenging the transgressions of mankind. She becomes this god of pestilence, this god of plague. And what's fascinating is that it occurs in the spring. The setting of the events that this document describes, the destruction of mankind, occur during the spring when the Nile is easily navigable. And I'm just going to read you a paragraph here on page 480. It says, Hathor Sekhmet becomes so delighted in destroying mankind for their rebellion that she does not stop. In her effort to quell her thirst for blood, Ra sends to the south to obtain red ochre, a dye found near Elephantine. The red ochre is ground and mixed with 7,000 jars of beer mash, and it becomes like human blood. Ra floods the delta, then uses the Nile that has turned to blood to trick Sekhmet into drinking it. She becomes drunk, and her thirst for blood is satisfied. She then refers to the kind, protective deity Hathor. So, and the other thing that this document refers to is a period of darkness that then gives way to a period of light. So we have parallels between water turning to blood. We have parallels between a period of darkness. And again, we know that it's in the spring, which is when you would find the death of the firstborn. That is also referred to in this inscription. Actually, it's not really an inscription. It's a painting on the walls of 3 different Ramessid kings during the 19th dynasty. So you find, the other thing that you find with this is that there is a slaughter of the Egyptians that occurs during the middle of the night that is associated with Hathor Sekhmet. Now, the interesting thing with this mythology, the story, is that later in the legend, a very aged god Ra creates Thoth, who has power to turn back the northern people, these Asiatic invaders that have invaded the Delta. Thoth now has power to turn them back. Hathor is conveniently retired to a sparsely populated western part of Lower Egypt. Hathor is Sekhmet continues to be associated with plagues and pestilence and healing from those pestilence. The other thing that you find in other papyruses from this point in time, you find that they refer to like the Ebers papyrus, which is a medical papyrus that describes different medical ailments that Egyptians face and cures from them. They talk about the plague of the Asiatics, which was some sort of boil, but we're really not quite sure on all of the details as how the disease would have manifested itself. But it was just a tremendous and horrific plague, which the Egyptian doctors, I'm using that term very loosely, but their physicians termed an Asiatic plague. That also fits into this particular point in time. Now, the document for the destruction of mankind is really dated anywhere perhaps between 1800, maybe even earlier, 1900 BCE, but it really fits the context somewhere between about 1600 and 1550 BCE. So that is another parallel that is just, adds perhaps to the evidence. Now, it is the scholarly consensus that, again, that there was other traditions of Sekhmet that went back to at least 1900, 2000 BCE to Egypt's Old Kingdom. So that's something to bear in mind. Don't jump in with both feet. Examine it critically. So I really do not endorse this being an account of the Exodus, but I think we do have to leave open the possibility that it could be, simply because we cannot disprove it. The other thing that we find is that, there is this idea of a great loss of life. That again is a parallel. And we also find that the idea of Hathor, and let me skip forward. I'm going to, when we look, I'm going to touch on Egyptian's calendar, or Egypt's calendar, and we're really going to go in greater depth next week. So if you guys are following along on the syllabus that I have posted on Facebook, we're going to push everything back next week, because remember, I took last week off. So we're just going to continue pushing everything back so we can cover all the material and give everything its due without just kind of glossing over stuff and missing anything. So when you study Egypt's calendar, you find that their civil calendar really parallels the plagues that are mentioned in Exodus. So, and the reason that I concluded this based on my study is that each Egyptian month venerated a different Egyptian deity. So that, in one month you may honor Ra, in another month you may venerate the goddess of granary, and each god had something to do with an agricultural activity that occurred during his or her month. So that, in the month of calving, you venerated the god of calving. In the month of harvest, you venerated, for instance, there was the goddess of flax. So say in, it was somewhere, I believe, around April, where you had venerated the goddess of flax to ensure that you would have a good harvest. So the Egyptian civil calendar was pretty fixed. It began in August, and it really did not include until July of the following year. Now, it was off sync from the solar calendar by about 5 days, and so they threw in what are called epigemal days at the end of the year, and these were about 5 extra days to bring the solar and lunar into sync. Egyptian months were all 30 days each. There was no variation in the lengths of months. But what is fascinating with where Moses and Aaron would have come to Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron probably came to Pharaoh right after the inundation, so right at the beginning of the Egyptian New Year. And we find that this would have probably been somewhere between mid-July to mid-August, and this would have been the month of Aket. But what's fascinating and what is associated with this month is the god Thoth. Remember that Thoth was mentioned in the destruction of mankind. He is created during this whole entire epic of the destruction of mankind. Let me just read you. I'm going to skip ahead to page 487, but it says, Egypt's various religious cults were tied to the nation's civil calendar. Each Egyptian month marked the veneration of a different Egyptian god. Within the first Egyptian month, Teki, the god Duji, or Greek Thoth, was worshipped. The center of his cult was Hermopolis in the southern Egypt. The mythology and tradition with Thoth was that the deity invented magic. Pharaoh Apophis, and Apophis was the Asiatic pharaoh that I identified as probably the most likely candidate for the pharaoh that Moses spoke with throughout most of the plagues there in the Delta region. It says, Apophis had challenged the gods to a duel. And for the context of this duel, go back and read the beginning of the chapter. For the context of Apophis challenging all the gods of Egypt to a duel, we have this from a papyrus that refers to this contest that Apophis seeks. So Apophis had challenged the gods of Egypt to a duel, claiming that Seth and probably the Delta pantheon were the most powerful god in the land. Yahweh seized the opportunity to demonstrate that these deities were nothing more than folklore and tricks of the magicians. Hence, Moses' and Aaron's magic was stronger than Duji's or Thoth's magic. When you have Moses' servant eating the magician's servants. So what's fascinating when we go through and we follow the progression of the plagues, you find that in the Egyptian context, the plagues make incredible sense because they're not just plagues that are occurring simply to show God's power. They are directly confronting the power of a particular Egyptian deity. So from mid-July to mid-August, you had Thoth, who was venerated. He's the god of magic. So Moses and Aaron coming to Pharaoh, and Moses casting his stick on the ground and it consuming these snakes and the serpents of the Egyptians. All of this plays into this idea and this motif of Israel's God being stronger and mightier and more powerful than the Egyptians' God or the Asiatics' God, because the Apophis had challenged the gods to a duel. So this is just, background information that we find. You also find in Egyptian history that when pharaohs died, they too were venerated. They became one with Ra. They were venerated. They were not really worshipped as a god, but they were definitely venerated. You brought offerings to them. You lit candles for them. So they were served in the afterlife. You had mortuary temples where after a king died, you would have priests that would still serve that deceased monarch, bringing him food, lighting candles, or taking care of his complex. All of the kings throughout, all the pharaohs throughout Egyptian's history, even until very late periods of time, always mention their righteous acts in restoring a previous monarch's offerings and its rations for the contributions to that particular temple cult. So oftentimes we find that different pharaohs become united with the gods of Egypt, and sometimes they are even personified as particular gods. What is interesting with Apophis is that Apophis was an Asiatic deity. In Egyptian mythology, in their hierarchy of gods, Apophis does not appear in Egyptian literature until very late. It is the 18th dynasty. So he doesn't appear until roughly somewhere between 1530 and 1450 BCE. And what is interesting about Apophis, as a political pharaoh, the Egyptians, the priesthood were bound by a right, perhaps an honor, to venerate this horrible monarch that had wreaked a lot of destruction on Egypt. He had been at war with the king of the south, and he was seen as an enemy, but he was still a king. And whether an enemy king or a rightful king, it was still the priest's duty to venerate him. But the priest did something that we really don't see in any other Egyptian motif regarding venerating a monarch. And that is, they really turn Apophis into this evil god, where he is, it is really the equivalent of Hydra in Greek mythology, where he is slain and every day he resurrects. And he is just really this god that performs a lot of evil against mankind. So you can kill him 1,000 times. Every morning he's going to resurrect to perform evil again. And what's fascinating with this is that there's this idea that he existed from the creation of the world, and that he was driven out by the creator God so that the order could be restored, and that he must be defeated. So, draw your parallels where you will, but you certainly see a lot of modern parallels with that as well. There's also this idea that he is bound to the earth for a long period of time. And in that bounding, he's not able to do some of the destruction that he can on his own, because if you kill him, he's just going to come back. He's going to regenerate again and be capable of even more destruction. So that kind of is where I'm going to stop this evening. Next week, we will actually get into the plagues and seeing how the plagues correspond to the Egyptian civil calendar. We're also going to see how understanding the Egyptian civil calendar allows us to understand when Israel's New Year began. You know, there's a lot of controversy on when Israel's New Year began. Understanding the Egyptian calendar and lining it up with the Hebrew plagues really provides the context that helps kind of clear up some questions. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. I'm so glad you guys are here and joined us this evening, and thank you so much for all your sweet comments. I appreciate that. It is so much fun to spend this time with you. And so next week we're going to go, just for those of you who are keeping track, from about 485 to 507. And I will change the heading on the broadcast, and I'll go ahead and just transfer everything over, all the information from the old class to this one. So any questions or comments? There was a lot of information that we covered tonight, and I tried to bring it in and show how it related to some of the archaeological information as well as to the written information that we have from other authors. What I did not mention tonight, I did mention it in previous nights, was the fact that we also have another papyrus that comes from Thebes, and it dates right around to 1600, 1620 BCE, where we have many of the names of the tribes of Israel, the patriarchs of Israel. We have Menahem, Naphtali, Asher, and then we still have a reference to a Paula, who may have been one of the Hebrew midwives that is mentioned in Exodus. So when people say there is no evidence for the Exodus, you know, I think we have to take that with a grain of salt. There's certainly no evidence in the 13th or the 12th century, but when you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, all of that information is just there, but no one's really taken a detailed investigation to it and really brought it to the forefront. All right, so Martha says, I am so amazed to see the variety of gods that existed in Egypt. Yes, you know, it really is. You know, for us modernly, we say, how could they justify that? And it's, you know, didn't they know better? But I think when you live in a very mythological world, things happen around you that you can't explain. Mythology seems to be a very logical recourse. Thank you so much, James. I appreciate that. I hope y'all have a fantastic weekend. Now, I do invite all of you guys to join us tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. We'll be there 10:30 Central. And then in a couple weeks, we will also be meeting in St. Francisville, June 10th to 11th. So if you're interested in that at all, please do go on to the Roots of Faith website on Facebook, and you can get more information there. But any other comments or questions? If not, we will call it an evening. We managed to finish right on time. So that's always fun to meet that deadline and that schedule. Okay. Martha says, I have never acknowledged how difficult it was for the nation of Israel to establish itself according to Yahweh's promises. Totally agree. You know, as we get into the Canaan conquest, we're going to be dealing with some of the obstacles that they faced back in 1500 BCE. And what's kind of amazing is that some of the obstacles that ancient Israel faced, you know, 3,000 years ago are actually some of the same obstacles that the modern state of Israel faces today. So, you know, when we study history, it's really because it also enlivens the future. So join me for that. We'll start that in about 2 weeks. And I will see you guys back next week. Shabbat Shalom. Have a fantastic evening. And we'll see you in the morning. Bye-bye.